You know what, folks? I bet you've never seen a group of people dig into someone else's property, then accidentally blow up their own system. Sounds like a Hollywood comedy. Nope, this is 100% real. My neighborhood's brilliant HOA managed to turn their $1 million clubhouse into a giant swimming pool in just one night. They thought they were saving money, but ended up going bankrupt because of their own stupidity. This story has enough drama, twists, and satisfying justice that you won't be able to look away from your screen. Comment more for part 2, because this story will definitely make you want to hear the next part immediately. And don't forget, you're listening to this story from QA Stories. My name is Jack Reed, and I've been living peacefully on my 20-acre ranch for the past 15 years. It's nothing fancy, just a modest farmhouse, a couple of barns, and enough land to keep my sanity intact. The property sits right on the edge of Willowbrook Heights. It's one of those upscale neighborhoods where every lawn looks like a golf course, and every mailbox costs more than most people's cars. I'm a retired civil engineer who specialized in water systems, and I chose this spot specifically because I wanted privacy and space. What I didn't expect was to become the target of the most power-hungry HOA president in the history of suburban America. Beatrice Sterling became HOA president about 3 years ago. And from what I heard through the grapevine, she'd been kicked out of her previous position at another neighborhood for some financial scandal. The woman was in her mid-50s, always dressed like she was heading to a board meeting, and had this, a way of talking that made you feel like you were being lectured by a disappointed school principal. She had this obsession with community improvement and property values. But what she really meant was expanding her little kingdom and making sure everyone bowed to her authority. The problem was my ranch sat right next to her precious community, and apparently, that was a problem that needed solving. It all started on a Tuesday morning in early March. I was having coffee on my porch with Buster, it's my faithful German shepherd, when I noticed a small group of people walking along the property, lined between my ranch and the HOA community. They were carrying surveying equipment and clipboards, acting like they owned the place. I watched them for about 20 minutes before deciding to walk over and see what was going on. That's when I met Sterling for the first time, and let me tell you, it was not a pleasant experience. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached the group. "Can I help you folks with something?" Sterling turned around, and I immediately noticed the way she looked at me like I was some kind of pest that had wandered onto her property. "Mr. Reed, I presume," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "I'm Beatrice Sterling, President of the Willowbrook Heights HOA. We're conducting a survey for our new community water conservation project." I nodded politely and asked what kind of project they were planning. That's when she dropped the bombshell that would change everything. "We are installing an automated irrigation system for our community gardens," she explained, gesturing toward the area near my property line. "To save costs, we've decided to dig our own well rather than rely on the municipal water supply. The location we've chosen is right here along the border of your property." I felt my stomach drop. As a former water systems engineer, I knew exactly what kind of problems could arise from unauthorized well drilling, especially in this area. I politely asked if they had obtained the proper permits and done soil surveys. Sterling's expression immediately hardened. "Mr. Reed, this is HOA business. We don't need your input on our community improvements." But here's where it gets interesting. After they left, I went back to my house and pulled out some old documents I'd kept from my engineering days. You see, my property used to be part of a larger agricultural operation back in the 1960s, and there were some very specific infrastructure elements that most people didn't know about. Hidden beneath my land, running from the old processing plant to the municipal connection, was a main water line that had been decommissioned on paper, but was still being used as a backup supply line for the entire area. The location Sterling had chosen for their well was sitting right on top of this pipe. The next morning, I found survey stakes driven into the ground along my property line, some of them clearly on my side of the boundary. I took photos, measured the distances, and documented everything. Then I did what any reasonable person would do. I called Sterling's office and left a polite message asking her to contact me about the boundary issue. She never called back. Instead, 2 days later, I received a certified letter on official HOA letterhead The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation, informing me that I was obstructing community development and that the HOA had every right to proceed with projects that benefit the greater good. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation. It's informing me that I was obstructing community development and that the HOA had every right to proceed with projects that benefit the greater good. That phrase stuck with me, the greater good. It was the kind of language used by people who think laws and boundaries are mere suggestions, especially when they're standing in the way of their ambitions. Over the next 2 weeks, construction activity ramped up. Trucks came and went, workers brought in drilling rigs, and survey markers multiplied along the disputed boundary. I contacted the county inspector's office and filed a formal complaint about unauthorized excavation and potential utility interference. But before any action could be taken, the drilling started. It was 6:45 in the morning when the first hammer strike echoed across the property line. I threw on my coat and boots and walked straight over with Buster at my side. What I saw made my stomach turn. The HOA's hired crew had brought in a small drill rig and was actively boring into the ground right above that old main line I had told them about in my letter, which they ignored. I waved down the site supervisor and tried to explain the risk, but he just shrugged and said they were following orders from Ms. Sterling. Then she's the one who'll be dealing with the consequences. I muttered. I walked back to my porch and called the water department. I gave them the map overlays I'd created, showing the location of the old main line, the new drilling coordinates, and the potential for catastrophic damage if they went deeper. They said they'd send someone out, but not until the following Monday. It was Friday. That night, I barely slept. I had the kind of unease in my gut that only comes from years of experience telling you something bad is about to happen. At 3:12 a.m., it did. The explosion shook my entire house. I shot out of bed and ran to the back window. Water hundreds of gallons per minute was shooting 30 feet into the air like a geyser. The HOA's drill had struck the old main line. A high-pressure rupture of that magnitude wasn't just a mistake, it was a full-blown infrastructure disaster. I grabbed my phone and started filming. Sterling and her contractors were rushing out of their cars in panic. The HOA's million-dollar clubhouse, just downhill from the drilling site, was already being flooded. By sunrise, the basement was underwater, and the surrounding lawns had turned into a swamp. Community members were arriving to attend a scheduled board meeting only to find the buildings submerged up to the windows. Sterling tried to control the narrative by blaming a burst municipal pipe. But I had video evidence, documentation, and emails proving they had been warned in advance. I uploaded it all online and copied local news stations. That's when the story went viral. News. Vans began parking along my fence. Reporters wanted interviews, engineers were called in to assess the damage, and community members, furious about the destruction, demanded answers. Sterling looked like a deer in headlights, stammering through press conferences and offering nonsensical explanations. But the worst part, for her at least, is that people started digging into her background. Turns out, Sterling had a long history of shady dealings. Multiple complaints had been filed in her previous HOA position before she was quietly dismissed. Here, she'd manipulated board elections, funneled funds to a construction company owned by her cousin, and strong-armed residents who questioned her authority. I'd had enough. I contacted a lawyer and filed a civil suit for property damage and harassment. But more than that, Ty decided to go public. I gave interviews, shared documentation, and started attending community meetings. I wasn't just fighting for my land. Annie Marai was fighting for everyone she had intimidated. The community began to fracture. Some still supported Sterling out of fear or ignorance. Others started demanding a full audit of HOA finances. A small group even began pushing for her removal. But Sterling wasn't going down without a fight. She doubled down on her power plays, issuing more violation notices, holding secret board meetings, and threatening dissenters with legal action. That's when I received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Sterling's Secrets." Inside were files, hundreds of them. HOA, internal documents, secret recordings, financial spreadsheets, and what appeared to be fraudulent permit applications, ... all tied to Sterling. Someone from inside her operation had turned whistleblower. Verified everything. The recordings included conversations about manipulating vote counts and burying infrastructure reports. The financial records showed large transfers to accounts tied to shell companies. And the permits, well, one of them used my name and address to authorize illegal drilling. That crossed the line. I compiled everything into a secure drive, made multiple copies, and prepared a presentation. At the next HOA meeting, one that had been moved off-site due to clubhouse flooding, stood up during the community comments section and plugged in my laptop. What I'm about to show you, I said, is not speculation. These are your HOA's own documents. I walked them through it line by line, chart by chart. By the end, people were speechless. Sterling sat frozen, her face a mix of rage and disbelief. When it ended, I handed printed packets to every board member and community resident in the room. I'm forwarding this to the city council, the county auditor, and the local DA's office, I said. What you do with it is up to you. The room erupted. Some applauded. Others shouted. Sterling stormed out. 2 days later, the district attorney announced a formal investigation. Sterling's house was raided, financial records seized, subpoenas issued. Suddenly, HOA leadership scrambled to distance themselves. Board resignations came one after the other. The truth was out, and I wasn't finished yet. The subject line was simple, but devastating. The truth about Beatrice Sterling's corruption and fraud. The email contained everything. High-definition video footage of Sterling's crews trespassing on my property, complete with GPS coordinates, and timestamps that proved the boundary violations. Copies of the fraudulent permit applications that Sterling had filed using my name and address. Internal HOA documents showing how Sterling had passed her self-serving regulation without proper authorization. And most damning of all, a detailed analysis of Sterling's financial records, showing suspicious payments from construction companies that had received HOA contracts. But the most shocking revelation was a series of recorded phone conversations between Sterling and her business associates discussing how to handle the Reed problem and maximize profits from the infrastructure crisis. The recordings had been provided by a former HOA board member who had been secretly documenting Sterling's corruption for months, waiting for the right moment to expose her. I watched from the back of the room as people started reading the email. On their phones, the change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped, eyes widened, and suddenly everyone was looking at Sterling with expressions of shock, disgust, and anger. She was still talking, completely unaware that her entire narrative was collapsing in real time around her. One by one, people started holding up their phones, showing Sterling the evidence that had just been delivered to their inboxes. The first person to speak up was George, who stood up from his seat near the front of the room and said in a loud, clear voice, Mrs. Sterling, would you like to explain why you filed drilling permits using Jack Reed's name and address without his knowledge or consent? That's when Sterling realized what was happening. She stopped mid-sentence, her face going from confident to confused to terrified in the span of about 10 seconds. She looked around the room and saw that everyone was staring at her with hostile expressions, and she could see the evidence of her crimes being shared from phone to phone throughout the audience. This is fake, she screamed, her composure completely shattered. This is all fabricated evidence. Jack Reed has been planning this character assassination for months. He's working with hackers and criminals to destroy my reputation. But nobody was listening anymore? The evidence was too overwhelming, too detailed, and too well documented to be dismissed as fabrication. The reporters were furiously taking notes and making phone calls to their editors. The city council members were huddled together, clearly discussing the legal implications of what they were seeing. Even the federal investigators were examining the evidence on their phones and taking what appeared to be official notes. Sterling tried desperately to regain control of the meeting, but it was too late. People were standing up and demanding explanations. How could she have filed permits using someone else's identity? Why had she blocked the fiber optic project? What was her relationship with the construction companies that kept getting lucrative HOA contracts? The questions were coming fast and furious. Sterling had no good answers for any of them. Finally, she couldn't take the pressure anymore. Sterling stormed toward the exit, pushing past reporters and ignoring the shouted questions that followed her. But she stopped at the doorway and turned back to face the room, her eyes wild with rage and desperation. She pointed straight at the nearest camera and screamed, "I won't let it end like this. Jack Reed, you picked the wrong enemy." Then she pulled out her phone and dialed a number right there in front of everyone. "I need to see you right now," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, it's time to use Plan B. Bring everything. We discussed it's time to destroy Jack Reed once and for all." As Sterling was leaving the building, she stopped next to one of the reporters and said something that made my blood run cold. "You want a real story? Ask Jack Reed about the environmental contamination on his property. Ask him about the toxic waste that he's been hiding under that ranch for 20 years. Ask him why he was so desperate to stop our drilling project, because he knew we were going to discover his dirty little secret." No. Sterling still had a secret backup plan. Is Plan B? And what is she talking about regarding environmental contamination? Everyone at CA Stories was on the edge of their seats. Let me know your predictions in the comments. What do you think she's going to do next? Sterling's Plan B turned out to be the most desperate and dangerous gambit of her entire criminal career within 24 hours of the disastrous community meeting. She had filed a federal lawsuit against me for environmental terrorism, conspiracy to commit ecocide, and willful endangerment of public health. Her new legal team, which included environmental lawyers and what appeared to be federal prosecutors, was claiming that I had been illegally storing toxic waste on my property for decades, and then I had sabotaged the drilling project to prevent the discovery of my crime. The lawsuit was accompanied by a media blitz that made the previous accusations look like minor disagreements. Sterling had somehow obtained preliminary soil samples from around my property. She was claiming that they showed evidence of industrial contamination that posed a serious threat to public health. She was alleging that my opposition to the drilling project had been motivated by fear of exposure, not concern for community safety. But Sterling had made a critical error in her desperation to destroy me. She had filed the lawsuit so quickly that her legal team hadn't had time to properly verify the soil samples or investigate the actual history of my property. They were relying entirely on Sterling's claims and some hastily prepared laboratory reports that would later prove to be falsified. More importantly, they didn't know that I had been expecting this attack and had prepared a devastating response. Even legitimate business relationships could be twisted into something sinister. But then I realized something crucial. Sterling was completely bluffing. If she'd actually had any real evidence of financial impropriety on my part, she would have used it months ago, instead of waiting until she was cornered in a federal courtroom. She was throwing out random accusations in a desperate attempt to create enough confusion and doubt to escape the consequences of her own criminal behavior. The judge seemed to recognize this too, because he immediately instructed the jury to disregard her outburst and ordered the bailiffs to restrain her. My attorney quickly addressed Sterling's accusations by presenting comprehensive financial records that showed all of my consulting income was properly documented and legally obtained. Every payment I'd received from construction companies had been for legitimate engineering services, and all taxes had been paid according to federal and state requirements. What Sterling had tried to use as a weapon against me actually ended up demonstrating my complete compliance with financial regulations and business ethics. The rest of the hearing was essentially a formality. The evidence that Dr. Chen had provided was so overwhelming that Sterling's legal team basically abandoned any attempt to defend her actions. The judge ordered an immediate expansion of the federal criminal investigation to include Sterling's environmental fraud schemes in other states, and he issued a permanent injunction preventing her from accessing any community funds or making any decisions on behalf of any homeowners association. But the real moment of justice came when the hearing ended and Sterling was walking out of the courtroom, still muttering about conspiracies and cover-ups. She was approached by two federal agents who had been waiting in the hallway, and they placed her under arrest right there in front of the assembled media. The charges were extensive: mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, environmental terrorism, extortion, money laundering, and racketeering under federal RICO statutes. The look on Sterling's face when she realized that her desperate legal gambit had not only failed, but had actually accelerated her own downfall was absolutely priceless. She had gone from being a local HOA president accused of corruption to a federal criminal facing decades in prison. The cameras captured every moment of her arrest, and the image of her being led away in handcuffs became the defining photograph of the entire scandal. The aftermath of Sterling's arrest was swift and comprehensive. Within days, federal investigators had uncovered a criminal enterprise that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of accomplices. Sterling had been running her HOA fraud schemes in 7 different communities over the past decade, stealing millions of dollars and destroying the lives of hundreds of homeowners who had dared to oppose her projects. The investigation revealed that Sterling's criminal network included corrupt city officials, fraudulent environmental consultants, construction companies that specialized in inflated contracts, and even some federal employees who had been providing inside information about regulatory enforcement. The scope of her corruption was so extensive that it became the subject of a congressional investigation into HOA oversight and regulation. As for the immediate aftermath in our community, the changes were dramatic and satisfying. The HOA immediately voted to dissolve Sterling's corrupt board of directors and held new elections with full transparency and community participation. They hired a forensic accounting firm to trace all of Sterling's fraudulent transactions and recover as much of the stolen money as possible. The recovered funds were used to properly repair the water damage to the clubhouse and implement genuine infrastructure improvements that actually benefited the community. I received a formal apology from both the HOA and the city government for the harassment and legal threats I had endured. More importantly, I received a substantial financial settlement that compensated me for legal costs, property damage, and the emotional stress of being falsely accused of terrorism and environmental crimes. The settlement was large enough to fund several water infrastructure improvement projects in rural communities that couldn't afford professional engineering services. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the response from other communities. Where Sterling had operated, property owners who had been victimized by her schemes in other states began coming forward with their own stories. And class action lawsuits were filed to recover the millions of dollars that Sterling had stolen. Over the years, several of these victims contacted me personally to thank me for having the courage to fight back against Sterling's intimidation tactics. The federal investigation also led to significant reforms in HOA oversight and regulation. Congress passed legislation requiring greater transparency in HOA finances, mandatory background checks for HOA board members, and federal oversight of infrastructure projects that affect public utilities. The legislation was informally known as the Sterling Act, ensuring that her name would be associated with the reforms needed to prevent similar corruption in the future. But the most meaningful moment came about 8 months after Sterling's arrest. I was sitting on my porch with Buster, enjoying a peaceful evening and watching the sunset over the restored community, when I heard a child's voice from the direction of the old HOA property. A little girl was walking with her mother past the site where the clubhouse had been rebuilt. She was asking questions about the small memorial garden that had been created near the entrance. "Mommy," the little girl asked, "what does this sign mean?" Her mother paused and read the inscription on the memorial plaque, in memory of the lessons learned from greed and corruption. May we always remember that true community strength comes from honesty, transparency, and respect for our neighbors. The mother looked thoughtful for a moment before answering. "It means that sometimes people do bad things because they want money and power, but when good people work together, they can make sure that justice is done." The little girl nodded solemnly and then asked, "What happened to the bad lady?" Mother smiled and said, "She went to prison for a very long time where she can't hurt anyone else. And the good man who stopped her is still living peacefully on his ranch, taking care of his animals and helping other communities with their water problems." While Sterling was being handcuffed and led away by federal agents, she turned back one last time to look at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "You think you've won?" she called out, her voice carrying across the courthouse steps. Just wait until they investigate your background more thoroughly. There are things about your past that you've kept hidden. Things that will destroy your reputation, just like you've destroyed mine. I felt a momentary flash of concern, but then I realized that Sterling was making one final desperate attempt to plant seeds of doubt and suspicion. The truth was that I had nothing to hide. My background had been thoroughly investigated by federal agents as part of their case against Sterling, and they had found nothing but a clean record of professional engineering work and community service. Sterling's final threat was just the last gasp of a criminal who couldn't accept that her victims had finally fought back and won. As I watched her being driven away in the federal transport vehicle, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction and closure. Justice had been served, not just for me, but for all the other victims of Sterling's crimes who had never had the resources or knowledge to fight back. As I was walking back to my truck after the sentencing hearing, a reporter approached me with some interesting news. "Mr. Reed, we've been investigating Sterling's network of associates, and we've discovered that she was planning to target several other communities with similar schemes. There's evidence that she had been planning to expand her operation nationally, with you being just the first of many property owners she intended to destroy. Would you be interested in helping other communities identify and stop similar corruption? Might not be the complete end of the story after all. Sterling's criminal network was much larger than anyone realized, and there might be other victims out there who need help fighting back against similar corruption." Case stories will continue. Following this story to see if there are more twists and turns ahead,